Hey everyone, today I wanted to do a video on how you can log into Instagram with Python. This method works for most websites. I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code. I'm going to add a file called, and this is going to be the Python file that does all the work. The first thing we need to do is import Selenium. Then we need to import another library called WebDriver Manager. This is going to make sure that our WebDriver that's working with Selenium is up to date. Now we can create a variable called driver and assign it to our WebDriver object. I'm going to save this and I'm going to run it. So as we can see, when we ran the code, WebDriver Manager found the latest version of the WebDriver that we need, and then it created this window here. This window is an automated test browser of Google Chrome, and this works the same way as any Google Chrome browser would. Now that we know our test browser is working, let's actually open up Instagram. We're going to call the driver object that we made, and then we're going to call the get method. And what the get method does is you can add a string in here of the website that you want to go to. I'm going to run the code again. Now the program is opening up our test browser and it's opening up Instagram. So now that the website is loading up, we need to make it so that the program enters in the username and password into these text fields. And the way that we do that is first by inspecting these elements with the Chrome DevTools. And when we click on these elements, we can use the information of the HTML to help our program identify these HTML elements. The username input is an input tag, and this input tag has an attribute called name, and the value of the name attribute is username. The reason we should care about the name attribute and its value is because Selenium has several different ways of locating HTML elements. One of these ways is finding an element by its name. If you run into a scenario where the tag you're trying to locate does not have a name, you can use any of these methods instead. Now that we know the username input tag has a name attribute, we can create a variable. I'm going to call this username element and assign its value to our driver object. And we're going to call the find element by name method, and we're going to put in the value of the name attribute. The password input element is going to be the exact same thing. We just need to change this to password and also give our variable a unique name. These variables represent the two HTML elements that we're going to put our information into. Right now, we don't have any information to put inside of these input tags. To make things simpler, I'm going to hard code the username and password. At this point, we have variables for the information that we want the computer to type. And we also have the location of where that information should be typed. The next thing we need to write is how the computer is actually going to type the information into those input fields. The way that we send keyboard input is with the send keys method. I'm going to call this username element. Then I'm going to call the send keys method. And what send keys does is it takes a string and then it sends whatever keys are in that string to the element. And what we want to send to the username element is our username right here. So I'm going to put in the variable username, and I'm going to do the same thing with the password. And change the name of the variable here as well. Okay, so a quick recap. We have variables for our username and password. We have the elements that need to have this information. And then we have these two lines that take the information and put it into those elements. Let's run our code again and notice something when it loads up. There's the Instagram logo, and then there's that load wheel. And after all of that, the elements that we're looking for pop up. And what you'll notice is back in terminal, we get this error message and it says, no such element exception, unable to locate element, CSS selector name equals username. This is interesting because we can inspect this another time and confirm that the input for the username has a name attribute with the value username. The password input is the same exact way. It has a name attribute with the value password. The reason we're getting this error that's saying those elements don't exist, even though that we can find them, is because this page loading is causing the program to look for those elements too quick. We need to slow down the program a little bit so that it waits for these elements to show up. I went ahead and put some comments here in green so we can keep track of all the different stuff that we're typing. Down at the bottom of the program, I'm going to add a variable called elements loaded. I'm going to assign this variable to false. And what this variable does is keep track of whether or not the elements that we're looking for have loaded or not. While these elements have not loaded, while this variable remains false, we're going to do all of this stuff. And then once that's done, we are going to set elements loaded to true. Now, this doesn't account for the error yet. In order to account for the error, I'm going to make a try except. While the elements have not loaded, try looking for them, and if you find them, set it to true, and that'll make this while loop break. If we encounter this error, we're going to pause the program for 1 second. So this while loop is going to keep going until we find our elements. It's going to try finding them and accept a no element exception, in which case it's going to pause the program for 1 second and then do the while loop all over again. There's a couple of imports that we need to take care of. This time.sleep command, it's coming from the time library. And so up here, I'm going to type import time. Another thing that I need to import is this no such element exception. The reason being is because this no such element exception is coming from the Selenium library, and it's not an exception that's built into Python. Let's run our code again. And there we go. It waited for these elements to load, and then it put in those credentials that we hard-coded in earlier. And you'll notice in terminal, there's no errors. The next step after these credentials are logged in, we need to press the enter key so that it attempts to log in. And since these credentials are wrong, it's going to tell us sorry. The changes we need to make involve these login credentials. Earlier, I said I was going to hard code this information, and this works, but I think a better way of doing this would be asking the user for the username and also asking for the password, but doing it in such a way that we retain the privacy of the password. In order to get user input, we're going to use the input method, which is a built-in Python method. Inside of these parentheses, we need to type a prompt for the user so that the user knows what the computer is asking. In this case, we're asking for the username. And this password is going to be very similar, except for the method that we're using is called getPass. GetPass is not built into Python, therefore we need to import the getPass library. This getPass method works in the same way as the input method, except for it conceals the letters you're typing so that your password remains secret. The last thing we need to do is tell the computer to press the enter key after it's typed in the username and password. And we can add that command within these parentheses here. We'll add a comma and type keys with a capital K dot return in all caps. These commands are typing in the username to the username element. Then it's typing in the password to the password element. And then after all that's typed in, it's pressing the enter key. And that's what's going to make us log in. Now that we have our enter key being pressed, there's one more import we need to have so that this code actually runs. And this import takes care of being able to send keys. Make sure that you're importing keys with a capital K here. Another thing we need to do is make sure that we're asking for the login credentials first. Otherwise, our browser is going to open up and not give us time to actually enter in our username and password. So at this point, we've written everything that we need in order to make the computer log in to Instagram for us. I'm going to run the code one more time. Immediately, it's asking for a username, and then it asks for a password. I'm going to type my password in, and it's going to look like I'm not doing anything, and that's because getPass is concealing my password and keeping it a secret. And so we're successful. The computer logged in to my Instagram. Some of you may be thinking, that's a lot of work just to log into Instagram. This is just a really simple example of Selenium and what it can do. And Selenium is a technology that's used for web automation and testing. And this example is just scratching the surface. I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions, please leave a comment.